Okay, so here's the second video in our little two-part series on getting our joints laid out and oriented and set up correctly for our girl geometry, sort of informing the rest of the rig that we'll be making this semester. And let's go ahead and jump into some orientation. So this should be, again, pretty easy, pretty familiar stuff. Once we get to the fingers, there's a slightly different approach we want to take in terms of getting our joints oriented. But let's do the familiar stuff first and get that out of the way. I'll grab my shoulder here. And again, I don't need my geometry right now, so I might restrict it so it doesn't get in the way of my selection. When you select hierarchy to grab everything underneath of it, click on rotation axis to see where everything's pointing, and bring back my joint orient tool. So we should be using the same settings that we've been gunning for the entire time, with our aim axis set to X, our up axis set to Y, and our world up direction set to Y positively. I just want to keep this up here and keep this open because I'm going to be using the tool a lot here in just a moment. So I might as well keep it around. Hit orient joints, and everything's doing as it should. Let's do the same for the hip. Select the hierarchy. Show off our rotation axes, which you can also do through the show and hide axis buttons up in your comet joint orient too. We just wanted to add a bunch of different ways to do that so it makes it easier on us to navigate. With those selected, I'll hit orient joints, and looks like it's okay down here, but remember I want these Y's to be pointed forward on the left side. So I might shift grab these, hit the reverse function, and then hit orient again. And they're kind of okay, but we'll look at fixing this in a moment since they're off at an angle. We'll probably correct this manually. Like, you can go ahead and go in here and try the different settings, right? So maybe try Z instead and see if that gets you closer. For me, it doesn't, and probably no dice up here as well. Yeah, maybe reverse might get me the closest up here. So I think this is probably the best it's gonna get. And we'll dial this in later using a similar technique that we do with our joints to just get those lined up. And again, if common joint orient isn't giving you the exact same results as me, as I've just done here, noodle around with these values. You probably don't want to change your up axis to X and have the aim axis also be X, but changing it to Y and Z, toggling on this reverse, as well as seeing a different Y and Z world direction might give you differing results as well. So just noodle around with those and find what solution works best for you. But those are partially oriented. Let's go ahead and do our fingers next. And the fingers are going to get complicated, and you'll see why here in just a moment. So I might grab everything all at once to save myself a few clicks. Select the hierarchy, show my axes, and orient them. Again, we want our X to be our aim, our up axis to be Y, and our world up to be Y. And all right. So this is okay. But if you'll notice, especially like here on the index, that these are coming out at an angle, right? We want our Y's to be coming up off towards, like off of the surface of the knuckle, sort of perpendicular to this flat surface, because that's the way we want our Y's to bend, right? Because we tried to bend this right now, this will curl to the side, and I don't know about you, but my knuckles can't do that, so that's not a very realistic deformation, not a very realistic bend. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab these rotate axes by hand and adjust them. And similar to the other joints that we've been looking at thus far, you can try with these different options and see if it gets you closer. But for me, it's not really doing it. I hit reverse and Y, and that's, at least the last two are pretty good. I'll still need to adjust to what's going on further up here. So in order to do so, we'll be using our rotate tool in conjunction with our select rotate axis script. And I don't think I'll need my comet joint orient anymore, so I'll go ahead and shut this down. But especially these two, like the first knuckle and the second one in my finger joint, I want those to change. So I'll first grab my LT index 1 and shift select to LT index 2. I'll grab my rotate tool. What I want to do is grab that select rotate axis, that cell RotAx. I want to click that, and now you can see I have grabbed both of these rotate axes. I want to pivot this so that the Y is looking in the direction it should. And the advantage we have here is that we can do multiple selections at once, so we don't have to go through one by one and fix them that way. So I'm feeling good about the second joint. The first one needs a little more work, so I'll just click off of it and click up again. I just select rotate axis to sort of send this more off. Oops, not that far off, but a little more off of the surface of the joint. Because again, we want this Y to be aligned with the way our knuckle is going to bend. If I deselect and go ahead and grab the hierarchy here and try and bend it again, now it looks like we're getting a little bit closer to a bend that would make sense for our index finger. And I might even rotate some of these a little bit more. And similarly, we could sit here and nitpick all day until we get the perfect bend, but I just want to get this about as close as I can to keep things moving as quickly as I can. So now let's take a look at what that looks like. Alright, that's a lot better. I might bring this over just a little bit, not to be super nitpicky, because some of that bending is looking weird, but this is up to your discretion on how much you want to put into in terms of effort to get this correct. And I'll show off the same for the thumb because the process will be identical for the rest of the fingers and we might speed up through it. But again, I'll select this, select my hierarchy, and grab the rotation axes. And again, I'll just change to my rotate tool and curve this so they're all facing out. And maybe work my way down just a little bit more. The Y is more along that way. And then lastly, we can test that bend again and see if that makes sense for the thumb to curl in. And I think it does. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm selecting the joint. I'm going to select the hierarchy and then use the select rotation axis, the cell RotAx button that we installed, to grab all of those and sort of work my way through rotating these how we need them to be. Because again, comet joint orient didn't really get us there. It got us kind of close, and even further along on the ring and pinky fingers are looking pretty good. Probably won't need as much adjustment. But since comet joint orient can't get us across the finish line, we still got to kind of dial it in and eyeball it a little bit. So now you know how to do that process. I'm going to speed through this for the sake of keeping things brief, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, I've got those set up how I'd like. So again, I've messed with those rotation axes by hand to sort of get them aligned to a little bit better of a way. So if you know, I grab every single bone here and select it in the hierarchy and rotate this, it should, let's see here. Nope, not that way. Let's go ahead and grab this in a different order. There we go. It should form a fist as I rotate this inwards, right? So again, we want that bend to be about as anatomically accurate as we can get it. So we want to make sure that we set those rotation axes to work a little bit more in our favor. And basically we're like altering the way the joint bends, right? And we just want that to be changed so it looks a lot better when we actually skin this up to the mesh and start painting weights and making sure that our finger bones are doing all that they should be. So let's go ahead and hide those rotation axes. I think I'm okay with them for now. I'll grab all of them again, select my hierarchy, and hit the RotAx button just to hide them away. Now we're about done here, but something that we do need to do is look for junk. So let's see here. Taking a look at sort of what we've been working on, right, as we oriented our bones and our fingers. We've been testing those rotations and using our select RotAx to adjust them, but we want to check for junk. And when I say junk, I'm looking for, you know, some unclean rotation values held in the attribute editor. So if I click over here, we can see in my rotate axis, under my transform attributes, that 48.030 is that adjustment that we made with our rotation axis. And even if I run back select rotate axis, right, you can see that it updates in real time. But we don't want that data to be held there. We want our joint orient to hold our junk, but we don't necessarily want our rotate axis to hold that junk. Because if you're not cognizant of that and you leave that be, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for our rotations to work and make sense once we start giving these controls. And, you know, if I try to zero this out, if you look at my thing, my orientation changes again, and now my finger's all messed up. So we can't use a modify freeze transformations, right? That doesn't work. So that's where our zero out script comes into play. So if I click that, you'll notice that now the rotate axis, and even I'll undo just to show it, but the rotate axis, if you pay attention and I click zero out, it now becomes 0. So now zeroing this out will get this back to that position. Unfortunately, this command works for the whole hierarchy, so I can just grab each of these thumbs and fingers, be it index, middle, ring, or pinky. select the hierarchy, and then run 0 out again. Because again, I can see the junk here. When I hit it, now it's gone. And clicking through, it looks like there is 0 junk on all of the joints. Yeah, that's what we want. Okay, so now our finger bones are done. We want to check for that junk in other places too, right? And I'll show you a little example of how you might get that. That might be with our leg, because I mentioned we wanted to clean this up a little bit later by moving it manually, and I'll do so now. Again, this Y is a little too far out. Like this way this leg would be raising is a little too unrealistic, so I want to grab that with select rotate axis and pull it in again to be at a better angle. It doesn't need to be like straight on the world axis, right? I still might give it a little angle out because my foot chain is even angled out a little bit, but I do want to sort of bring that back in a little bit. I'll select this and repeat that process with not select hierarchy, but select rotate axis, but I'll repeat that process with my knee as well. And by altering this just on one axis, right, we're not changing where the X is aiming to, we're just changing the Y where it's pointing. So when we bend these up and out away from the body, you know, that abduction and adduction motion, we're able to control that in a little more realistic way. All right, so I like that. I again have junk on my rotate axis, so I'll use 0 out to do just that. Now there's no junk in there. And I think everything should be oriented as it needs to. So I'll grab these two, I'll select the hierarchy and turn off the rotation axes so I don't need to see them. And let's go ahead and parent those up. Oh, but before I do, actually, I do want to make one small adjustment to my eye before I forget. So I'll click on LTI and hit F to frame it, bring my rotation axis. And we just want this X to be facing forward on the left side. It's going to be sort of our aim control, basically. We want the primary axis X to drive that. So I'm not going to use select rotate axis, or I'm not going to hit D on my keyboard. I'm just going to rotate this just straight up. So, oops, that's the keyframe. But again, I don't want this manipulator. I just want the regular rotate manipulator, and I just want to rotate this 90 degrees forward. I'll just key it in over here to make sure that's nice and clean. Because I just want this X facing directly forward. And once we're done, we can run a regular freeze transformations on this. So modify, freeze transformations. It won't work on the translate, but it will work on the rotate. The big one we're looking for here in this instance is to have your rotate X, Y, and Z all be zeroed out. Now with that said, and again, like we did that so our rotate axis still has zeros because we didn't select rotate axis. But now with that done, we'll just finish things up by parenting all of our bones up to the geometry, and then we'll go ahead and flip this over, and we will be done setting up this little bone layout. So I'll grab the clavicle, go down here and grab the spine. Again, I want to grab the clavicle first and the spine last and hit P to parent. So we have that bone drawing in this direction. I don't want to do that in the other direction, right? Where the little bit of this bone is pointing towards down here. Now my sort of hierarchy has been messed up, and my clavicle is the big daddy, the parent of this, not the root, and I don't want that. So again, grab the parent last with shift and hit P to parent. I'll repeat the same for my hip. I'm grabbing the hip first, shift clicking my root, which is where I want it to connect to, and hit P to parent. Hopefully you're a little familiar with this after working on bony. And I'll do the same here with each of my fingers, but I can also do this in one fell swoop by just selecting all of my fingers. And again, not selecting the hierarchy, but just shift selecting all of them. And I just want to grab my hand bone last. Whatever you choose last when you're shift selecting allows you to make that the parent. I'll hit P again to parent. And now all of my finger bones are parented up. Lastly, we'll get to the jaw and the eye. And if you're paying attention over here, right, like my outline is shrinking pretty severely, especially after making that change with the fingers where they were parented up. Since they're now the child of like our overarching root system, they're now hidden away. And our outline is a little cleaner too for it. So I'll go up here, I'll turn my RotAx off because I left it on for the eye. I want to parent the eye to the neck, so I'll grab that last and hit P. And same for the jaw. So I'm going to grab the jaw first, hold down shift for the neck, and hit P. All right. And one last thing in terms of adjusting some of these bends, like you might want to go through and adjust all these rotations and maybe I think this rotation isn't realistic enough, and I want this to be rotated so, you know, the wrist is sort of up here and aligned with the shoulder. I can also use select rotation axis for that, so I can click cell RotAx. I might turn on the rotation axis too. Like I would angle this just a little bit downward, ever so slightly, but it is affecting the rotate axis here in our attribute editor. So if I click off and rotate it, you know, it's a little bit closer to actually passing through the shoulder. So this is sort of our final step in cleaning things up before we're ready to mirror over. And same goes for the knee. If I wanted to, you know, have this bend up, and maybe I wanted to adjust that over so it's a little more in line with the hip bone, I could also use select rotate axis and adjust that ever so slightly to get that bend to work. Point being is that if you want to make those changes to your rig, make them now, sort of a speak now or forever hold your peace sort of situation. Because once we start getting this skinned up and once we start getting this mirrored over, it's going to be a lot more difficult to adjust that. But I'm fine with those for now. I'll turn off the rotation axis, and before I move on, I do want to freeze that out. Can't use freeze transformations, but we can use our zero out script. Because again, we don't want this junk data in our rotate axis. So I hit zero out, and now that is back to zero without actually affecting the joint orientation, and we can mirror things over. Just some last housekeeping before you do that. You might want to go back to ortho and make sure nothing's out of alignment. Like, we still want our spine to be on the center, so when we mirror things over, that it's actually accurate. If you were testing your control curves earlier, and you know these values might be just a little bit off, you do want to make sure they're zeroed out as well, because you need this to be directly on the line of symmetry. Otherwise, your mirror might be a little bit off, and it'll be kind of confusing. But now with that done, again, we'll go ahead and mirror things over, similar to how we did with bony. We just want to grab the first joint in the chain, right? If I hover over my outliner with this selected and I hit F, that LT clavicle is what we want to reflect, right? Because everything underneath of that in the hierarchy is LT all the way down. So we will instead change that to RT with our little mirror skeleton tool. So again, make sure your menu sets are not on animation or modeling, but are on rigging. And we'll go down to skeleton, down to mirror joints, into our options box. My options by default here are what we're looking for, but just to review, you want to mirror across Y and Z. You want the function to be behavior, not orientation. And you want to search for LT and replace it with RT, or whatever other naming conventions you used when you gave them the left and right monikers. And I'll mirror that over. All right, looks like it came in A-OK. Nothing's misaligned. And we'll repeat that situation, that operation rather, for the hip. And something else that might be useful for you is the hotkey G. Basically what G does is that it repeats the last sort of operation. So if I, did a parent constrain, then it would parent constrain again. Or if I did a joint orientation, it would orient the joints again. In this case, I ran mirror skeleton, so if I hit G, it mirrors my skeleton again. And it does the same operation, keeping all of the settings that we used, so everything is RT now, as opposed to LT. And I'll do that for the eye. G. And now we're laid out. So we're just about done. I might do one last little thing to help keep my viewport organized, and that's just to make another display layer for our skeleton geometry, or not our geometry, but just for our skeleton and our joints, just to help keep our viewport a little bit cleaner and maybe make it more user-friendly if we ever pass this off to an animator, right? So I'll just grab my root, go up to select hierarchy, everything is white so you know that it's selected, and then I'll go down to the bottom right corner where my display layers are. And again, if you don't see this, you might be in your attribute editor or your modeling toolkit. You need to be in your channel box or layer editor to get to the display layers. But with that whole hierarchy selected, you just want to hit this button over here on the right. It's the fourth furthest on the right. The little sheet of paper with a blue dot on it creates a new layer and assigns selected objects. So it looks like it's been added. Let's toggle the V button. I'll even deselect, but toggle the V button for visibility. And it looks like I can now switch off the visibility for all of my joints. I can also restrict it if it gets in the way later, but that just helps keep us a little bit more organized. I'll double click on layer and go ahead and rename it using our similar conventions just so we know what this layer is and sort of what it does. So I'll just make this joint underscore LYR. I hit save. Now this has been saved out and everything's organized. So you've done it. You've prevailed. You've managed to get the joints laid out, and after you did that, you oriented them, fixed our fingers up, and reflected them across the line of symmetry. We just wanted to make sure that we have no junk before we do that. So again, we use our cell RotAx to zero out our rotation axes, and in doing so, we're able to get a joint layout. And that's why we're doing all the work on the left side, right? Is because once that is finished up, we can just mirror it to the right, and we can be done with it. So yeah. To finally review, we just oriented our bones after we got them laid out. We fixed our fingers a little bit with joint orient, but mostly so select rotation axis. After that, we made sure everything was sort of zeroed out by checking for junk, and we even tried some of the rotations on our whole rig, so we just wanted to adjust how things bend and deform around our joints with that select rotate axis. And in doing so, we're able to set up a better bend and get things a little more accurate. And lastly, we did check for junk. So again, using that zero out script to grab everything and make sure that nothing is sitting in the rotate axis attribute. So we want that to be free and clear for once our rig starts getting skinned up and getting controls for it. So that's all for this section. Your assignment next will be to try and recreate these steps that we've done on a different piece of geometry. And we'll go ahead and end it there. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Hopefully this was a little bit more review at this point, and you're starting to get those concepts down.